The autopsy report, when it was finally quietly filed, was a masterpiece of fiction. It listed 6 men, dead in the grand dining hall of the Carelli mansion. The cause of death for the Don, Marcello the Trident Carelli, and his 4 most trusted capo regimes was listed as acute cardiac arrest, a synchronized failure of 5 hardened hearts. The 6th man, consigliere Enzo Bianco, was found in the hallway. His death was ruled a self-inflicted gunshot wound, despite the fact that the piano wire that had severed his larynx was still embedded in his neck. The police, the press, and the other 5 families all settled on the same comfortable story: a botched coup d'etat. Enzo Bianco, they said, had tried to seize control, poisoning the Don and his inner circle, and then, in a moment of cowardice, took his own life when his plan was discovered. It was a clean, simple, and utterly false narrative. It was the story that had to be told, because the truth was unthinkable. The truth was not in the dining hall. It was in the pantry, where 2 17-year-old girls stood, their hands scrubbed raw, the faint chemical smell of bitter almonds clinging to their dresses. The truth was that the most secure fortress of organized crime in New York City had not been taken by an army or by a rival Don, or even by a disgruntled consigliere. It had been hollowed out, clinically and silently from the inside, by the 2 people in the world Don Marcello had never once considered a threat. This is the story of Lucia and Rosa Corelli. It is the story of how 2 teenage daughters, deemed too flawed and too fragile for the family books, orchestrated the single most precise extermination in the history of the American underworld. And it is the story of why their names, their actions, and their very existence were scrubbed from the ledgers of organized crime, buried so deep that their legend survived only as a whisper of a haunted house. To understand how they did it, we must go back 6 months earlier to the cold spring morning when the sisters first returned home. Don Marcello, the Trident Carelli, was a man built of old-world stone. His power, cultivated in the bloody bootleg wars of the 1920s, was absolute. His mansion on the outskirts of New York was less a home than a fortress, a monument to his paranoia. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale cigar smoke, anise, and the oppressive metallic scent of fear. Marcello ruled his family with 2 things: brutal, unthinking violence and an unshakable adherence to tradition. And in his traditional world, daughters were not heirs, they were assets. They were bargaining chips to be polished, presented and traded to secure alliances and cement power. He had no sons, a fact that sat on his soul like a cancer. He had only Lucia and Rosa, the twins, recently returned from a finishing school in Switzerland, and as he looked at them in his cavernous oak-paneled study, he felt nothing but profound disappointment. Lucia, at 17, was a perfect, cold beauty. She had her father's obsidian eyes and her mother's defiant chin. She was the coin he could spend. She was sharp, arrogant, and he saw her defiance as a flaw he would soon beat out of her. Then there was Rosa. Rosa was his shame. A childhood bout with smallpox had left her with a faint, almost imperceptible limp and a pale, crescent-shaped scar on her left cheek. In Marcello's world, she was damaged goods, unmarriageable, worthless. She was quiet, her eyes always downcast, and he mistook her silence for stupidity, her observance for meekness. He never noticed the way she watched, the way she catalogued every servant's whisper, every guard's routine, every secret kept and every lie told. She was a ghost in her own home, and he had made her that way. That morning he laid out their futures as if discussing livestock. "Lucia," he announced, not looking up from his ledger, "you will be married. Rocco Barzini's son. It seals the territory." A month. Lucia's hands clenched, but her face remained marble. "And Rosa," he continued with a wave of dismissal, "will be sent to the Sisters of Mercy upstate. She will take vows. It is appropriate. A convent that was, in reality, a dumping ground for the inconvenient. A prison of piety." He waited for the tears, the pleading, the hysteria he expected from women. Instead, he got silence. Lucia, after a long, cold moment, simply inclined her head. "As you wish, Papa." And that cold, unnatural obedience, that perfect submission, was the first thing in 10 years that had ever truly un-ABC'd Don Marcello Carelli. He mistook it for surrender. It was, in fact, a declaration of war. That night, the facade of submission crumbled. In the nursery-turned-bedroom they still shared, Lucia paced like a caged panther, her fury a physical, vibrating force in the room. "He sells me," she hissed, her voice a low rasp. "He sells me like a piece of meat to that animal Barzini's son, and he buries you alive." Rosa was not pacing. She sat at the large window, watching the rain lance down on the manicured lawns. She was perfectly still. "Yes," she said, her voice quiet as the damp. "That is his plan." Lucia stopped, rounding on her sister. "You accept this? After what he did to Mama?" Rosa's gaze shifted from the window to her sister. "Accept? No. I've been planning." She rose and the faint limp seemed to vanish, replaced by a cold, measured purpose. She walked to an old, ornate wardrobe, pressed a knot in the wood, and a false panel clicked open. It was not jewelry or letters inside. It was a collection of small amber-colored bottles, a thick ledger, and several medical textbooks. "You learned etiquette and French," Rosa said, her hand resting on a chemistry text. "I learned toxicology. I learned strategy." She had never stopped learning. While Lucia was being presented, Rosa was invisible. She had spent years listening to the guards, to the cooks, to her father's meetings through the heating grates. She knew the house better than the architect. She knew its secret passages, built by the original bootlegger owner. She knew the servants' grievances, the soldiers' debts, and most importantly, she knew her father's true structural weakness, his consigliere, Enzo Bianco. Enzo was ambitious, smart, and devoured by a resentment he kept expertly hidden. Marcello treated him like a clerk, humiliating him, second-guessing him, but relying on him for everything. "Father thinks Enzo is his dog," Rosa whispered. "But a starving dog is loyal only to the hand that offers meat. We will offer him the entire house." Lucia stared at her sister, truly seeing her for the first time. The scar on her cheek seemed less a flaw than a sigil of some dark promise. The plan was born in that moment, not of escape but of succession. They would not be pawns, they would not be victims. They would be the architects of a new order, and they would build it on the grave of the old one. "But first," Rosa said, closing the panel, "we have to isolate him. He has one man who is truly, blindly loyal, one man who must be removed." She tapped a name in her private ledger, Bastiano the Bull Petrucci. Bastiano the Bull Petrucci was everything Don Marcello admired, loyal, brutal, and thoroughly unimaginative. He was the capo regime who ran the docks, the heart of the Carelli import-export empire, and he had been with Marcello since the beginning. He was also the only man in the inner circle who openly distrusted Enzo Bianco, seeing him as a book-smart weakling. To the sisters, Bastiano was the first load-bearing wall that had to be demolished. To break him, they would use her father's most reliable tool against him, his own paranoia. Rosa had observed Bastiano's ritual for years. Every Thursday, he met with Marcello in the study, and every Thursday, he brought a box of fresh cannoli from a specific bakery in Little Italy, a sign of respect and fealty. Rosa's plan was twofold, a symphony of poison and paper. First, Lucia made her move. She accidentally encountered Enzo in the library, playing the part of the dutiful, frightened daughter. She spoke of her upcoming marriage, of her fear of the Barzinis. Then, a perfectly placed whisper. "My father, he seemed so stressed. He worries about the docks. He said Bastiano has been getting comfortable." She let the words hang, a seed of poison planted in Enzo's fertile mind. Days later, Rosa acted. She had cultivated an alliance with one of the kitchen maids, a girl whose younger brother Rosa had saved from a fever with Swiss medicine, aspirin and antibiotics, stolen from her father's physician. The maid owed her. On the Thursday of Bastiano's visit, the maid, her hands shaking, allowed Rosa into the kitchen. Rosa didn't poison the cannoli meant for her father, not lethally. She used a small measured dose of digitalis, extracted from the foxglove in the garden, enough to mimic the symptoms of a severe heart episode, enough to shatter his composure. Phase 2 was the paper. Rosa, a meticulous forger, had studied letters from a rival, Don Tartaglia, that her father kept in his desk. She mimicked the handwriting perfectly on a slip of paper, a fabricated note thanking Bastiano for information on the new dock shipments. She gave the note to the maid, instructing her to find it in the hall after the Don fell ill. The scene played out like a grand dark opera. Bastiano presented the cannoli. The Don ate one. Minutes later, he was clutching his chest, his face purple, gasping for air. As he fell, the maid discovered the note. Enzo, rushing to his boss's aid, was the one to pick it up. He read it, his face a mask of shocked discovery. Marcello, pale and writhing on the floor, saw the note in Enzo's hand. He saw the betrayal. He saw his most loyal capo standing over him, a box of poisoned pastry in his hand. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He just looked. Hours later, after the doctor had stabilized him, Don Marcello, his voice a hoarse rasp, summoned Enzo. He didn't ask questions. He gave a single cold order. Bastiano, the bull Petrucci, was taken for a ride. He was never seen again. And in the vacuum of power, Enzo Bianco, the consigliere, was promoted, now acting as his Don's right-hand man, more powerful and more terrified than he had ever been. The fall of Bastiano Petrucci solidified Enzo Bianco's position, but it also shackled him to a throne of fear. Don Marcello, recovering from his heart scare, was more volatile and paranoid than ever. He trusted no one. Enzo, who had uncovered the plot, was now the target of that same suffocating suspicion. He was the Don's man, which meant he was the man the Don watched closest. He was a prisoner of his own success, and the sisters knew it. This was the moment Lucia had been waiting for. She found him in the library late at night, nursing a glass of whiskey. She didn't approach him with conspiracy. She approached him with fear. She played the role of the terrified daughter, trapped in a house with a father she believed was descending into madness. "He's not the same since he got sick, Enzo," she whispered, her voice trembling. He looks at everyone, he looks at me. He's convinced Bastiano wasn't alone." She let him absorb her terror, letting it mirror his own. She described the way her father watched him, the way he second-guessed his reports. "He trusts no one," she said, her eyes wide. "He's going to tear this family apart looking for ghosts. And when he's done, what happens to the people who know too much? What happens to you, Enzo?" She had him. He saw his own execution in her words. And so she offered him an alliance. Not a coup, a stabilization. She could influence her father. She was his daughter, the one he was about to marry off. She was the only one who could soothe him. "Help me," she pleaded, "and I can help you. Protect me, and I can protect you." Enzo, blinded by his ambition and his mortal fear of Marcello, saw what he wanted to see. A naive, scared girl he could manipulate. He saw a path to controlling the Don through his favorite daughter. He agreed. He would be her protector. He began to tell her things, small things at first, schedules, details of the Barzini deal, who was in favor, who was out. He thought he was gaining an asset, a spy in the Don's private quarters. He had no idea he had just become a pawn in a game he couldn't even see. He was handing the sisters the keys to the kingdom, one secret at a time. The sisters' plan, however, hit a wall, a silent, unmoving wall of flesh and blood. In the wake of Bastiano's betrayal, Don Marcello had sent for a new bodyguard, a man imported directly from the mountains of Sicily. He was known only as Il Lupo, the wolf. He was not a soldato. He was not a capo. He was a shadow, a creature of pure, feral loyalty. He was gaunt, with dead black eyes, and he never ever spoke. He dressed in a rumpled black suit, and his only visible possession was a set of rosary beads he constantly worried with his thumb. He was the physical manifestation of Marcello's paranoia. He tasted every bite of the Don's food. He slept on a straw mat outside Marcello's bedroom door. He followed him everywhere, a few paces behind, his hands always clasped, his eyes always scanning. Il Lupo was immune to the sisters' strategies. He was immune to Lucia's fabricated charm. She would smile at him, and he would look through her as if she were glass. And more terrifyingly, he was the only person in the house who saw Rosa. He didn't look at her with pity or dismissal. When his eyes fell on her, it was with a flicker of cold animal recognition. He saw a fellow predator. He saw the other shadow in the house. This changed the equation. The sisters could no longer get to their father. A simple poison was impossible. Ill-fabricated betrayal was useless. as Il Lupo had no ambition, no connections, no vice they could exploit. He was a closed loop of loyalty. "We must find another way," Lucia hissed, her impatience growing. The wedding to Rocco Barzini's son was only weeks away. "He's just a man," Rosa said, her voice thoughtful, "and every man has a pattern." For a week, Rosa did nothing but watch the wolf. She used her hidden passages, her grate in the study, her invisibility. And she found it. Il Lupo had one single deviation from his duty. Every Sunday at precisely 6 in the morning, before the dawn awoke, he left the mansion. He walked 2 miles to a small, secluded chapel, St. Jude's, and took Mass. He was gone for exactly 1 hour. It was his only ritual, his only and anything. "He's not a weapon," Rosa whispered to Lucia, a plan forming in her cold, brilliant mind. "He's a shield, and we're going to use Rocco Barzini to take it away." The plan to remove Il Lupo was far more dangerous than the one that had dispatched Bastiano. It required the sisters to move from internal manipulation to external agitation. They had to provoke an enemy and hope the ensuing chaos served their purpose. The catalyst, however, would not be found in a schedule, but in the past. During the 1-hour window that Il Lupo was at Mass, Rosa finally had access to her father's study. She wasn't just observing, she was searching. She knew the combination to his private safe. She had watched him open it through the heating grate hundreds of times. She wasn't after money or the main ledgers. She was looking for leverage. Behind a false backing, she found a small tin box. Inside were not bonds but letters and a physician's private journal. It was her mother's. She and Lucia had been told their mother died of a long, wasting sickness, a weakness of the lungs. The journal told a different story. It was filled with entries of a vibrant, unhappy woman, a woman who had fallen in love with a musician, a woman who was making detailed plans to take her 2 young daughters and flee back to Italy, away from the monster she had married. Then the journal entries changed. She wrote of dizziness, of nausea, of a metallic taste in her mouth. Rosa, her chemical knowledge sharp, recognized the symptoms instantly. Arsenic, a slow dose, cumulative poison. The final entry wasn't from her mother at all. It was a single line written in her father's sharp, brutal script on a doctor's prescription note. "No one leaves the family." Rosa felt the blood drain from her face. This was not the act of a cruel man. This was the work of a monster. She brought the journal to Lucia. The ambition in Lucia's eyes, the fire for the coup, was instantly extinguished. It was replaced by something far colder, far purer. A glacial, bottomless hatred. This was no longer a game of power. It was not a succession, it was an execution. "The wedding," Lucia said, her voice barely a whisper, "is a distraction. Enzo is a fool." She closed the journal, her knuckles white. "We are not taking his family, Rosa. We are burning it to the ground, and he will be the first." The murder of their mother changed the timeline. It changed the stakes. The wedding to Rocco Barzini's son was no longer just a threat. It was an intolerable insult. And Il Lupo was no longer just an obstacle. He was the final guardian of their mother's killer. They had to turn him or destroy him. They decided to do both. The plan was intricate, designed to fold in on itself. First, Lucia intensified her whisper campaign to Enzo. She fed his paranoia, her own terror now amplified by her impending marriage. "My father," she cried. "He's mad. He trusts no one. He's even watching Il Lupo. He thinks Il Lupo is talking to the Barzinis." This was a lie, of course, but it was a believable one. A paranoid Don would naturally suspect his bodyguard of being a double agent for the family he was forcing an alliance with. Simultaneously, Rosa, the ghost, took her own step. She knew Rocco Barzini was an arrogant, violent man who chafed at the peace Marcello was enforcing. He saw the marriage as a sign of Marcello's weakness. Rosa used this. She wrote an anonymous note, again mimicking a hand she wasn't supposed to know. This time Enzo's. The note was simple, addressed to a known Barzini soldier. "Marcello's wolf is old. He's at St. Jude's, alone, every Sunday at 6, a gift." She had the same kitchen maid, the one indebted to her, pass the note to her cousin, a low-level numbers runner in the Barzini territory. It was a terrifying gamble. Would Barzini see it as an opportunity to weaken Marcello by killing his shadow? Or would he see it as a transparent trap? The sisters waited. Sunday morning came, the clock in the hall ticked. 6 a.m., 7 a.m. Il Lupo's hour was up. 7:30. The front door of the mansion burst open. It was Don Marcello. He was not calm. He was vibrating with a rage that seemed to suck the air from the room. "Enzo!" he roared. "Where is he? Where is my man?" Il Lupo was late. He had in fact been ambushed on the steps of the chapel. He fought like his namesake, killing 2 Barzini soldiers before they overwhelmed him. He was never ever coming back. Marcello Carelli, his last shield gone, was now utterly, terrifyingly alone. The death of Il Lupo was not the victory the sisters had intended. It was a catastrophe. It was the one variable they had miscalculated. They had assumed the wolf's death would be blamed on Barzini, pushing their father to rely more on Enzo and, by extension, on them. They were wrong. The loss of his one incorruptible man didn't just break Marcello's paranoia, it shattered it. He was now a cornered animal, and in his madness, he found a terrifying, dangerous clarity. He looked at the pieces on the board. Bastiano, his most loyal capo, betrayed him. Il Lupo, his shadow, was murdered by Barzini's men. The Barzini alliance, which he had forced, was the common denominator, and who had been warning him about both? Enzo. And who was at the center of the Barzini alliance? His daughter, Lucia. He connected the dots. It was a conspiracy. Enzo and Barzini were working together, using his own daughter as the final piece to seal their takeover. He, Don Marcello Corelli, was being played. The time for subtlety was over. He stormed through the house, his soldati scrambling behind him. He burst into the sisters' room, finding them in a feigned state of mourning. "The games are over," he snarled. He grabbed Lucia by the arm, his fingers biting into her flesh. "The wedding is tonight. You will be Mrs. Barzini by midnight, or you will be in the river." He shoved her toward 2 guards. "Lock her in her room. Put a man on the door." Then he turned to Rosa. His eyes were cold, devoid of any recognition. She was not his daughter. She was a loose end, a simple girl who had seen too much. "Take her to the cellar," he commanded a different guard. "She waits there. The Barzinis can decide what to do with the damaged one." The heavy oak door of the cellar slammed shut. The iron bar dropped into place. The sisters were separated. The plan was in ruins. Lucia was a prisoner, and Rosa had been buried alive. The cellar was cold, smelling of damp earth, spoiled wine, and desperation. The single soldato guarding the door, a brute named Paulie, lit a cigarette, leaning back in his chair. He was guarding a cripple. An easy night. He didn't hear the faint scrape of stone on stone from the far corner of the room. He didn't hear the soft footfall on the dirt floor. Rosa emerged from the blackness. This was not a prison to her. This was her kingdom. While Lucia had been the face of the family, Rosa had been the shadow. She had spent years in the dark exploring the old forgotten bootlegger tunnels that spiderwebbed beneath the mansion. The cellar was her nexus. The weak one, the flawed one, the invisible one, had been mastering the darkness. She was holding a length of piano wire, the handles fashioned from small blocks of wood. Paulie, the guard, heard a slight sigh of air behind him. He started to turn. He never finished. Rosa was lethally efficient, the wire sinking deep before he could even process the attack. He was dead in 20 seconds. She did not panic. She did not flee. She moved. She dragged the body into the tunnel and covered it with a tarp. She walked up the main cellar stairs and, listening, slowly lifted the iron bar. She slipped into the main hall like a wisp of smoke. The house was in chaos, preparing for the wedding feast. She moved unseen to her father's study. The safe, she opened it. She didn't take the money. She took the real ledger, the one that listed every judge, every police chief, every politician on her father's payroll. This was the true source of his power. She tucked it into the hidden lining of her dress. Then she proceeded to the kitchen. The cooks were screaming at each other, frantic. They didn't see the ghost slip into the pantry. They didn't see her open the small amber bottle. They didn't see her add a fine crystalline powder to the decanter of Special Reserve Chianti, the one only her father and his capos were permitted to drink, the one they would use for the celebratory toast. She returned to the cellar, barring the door from the inside. She waited in the dark, a phantom holding the family's heart in her hand. Minutes later, a frantic, Muffled scratching came from the other side of the cellar. From the hidden passage, it was Lucia. She had picked the lock on her bedroom door. The sisters met in the darkness. "It's done?" Lucia breathed. Rosa nodded, holding up the heavy ledger. "The wine is poured. Now, we just need to get Enzo." The great hall was set for a wedding feast, but it felt like a funeral. Don Marcello Carelli sat at the head of the long table, his face a thundercloud. With him were his four most loyal capo regimes, the pillars of his family, the only men he still trusted. Rocco Barzini and his son had been summoned, but were not yet present. This was a family-first toast, a show of strength. Enzo Bianco, his face pale with sweat, paced in the outer hall, his hand on the gun in his pocket. He believed Lucia was locked in her room. He believed he was waiting for the Barzinis to arrive, at which point he would make his desperate, suicidal move against Marcello. He was a dead man waiting. Then the doors to the hall opened. Lucia entered. She was not in a traveling suit. She was wearing the white silk wedding gown her mother had worn. She was a vision of pure, tragic beauty. Her father smiled, a predatory, victorious grin. "There she is," he boomed. "My beautiful daughter. A toast." He stood, raising his glass of the special reserve Chianti. "To family, and to new family." His four capos stood, raising their glasses in unison. "To family," they echoed. They all drank deep. Lucia, who had been given a glass by her father, simply held hers. It upsets my stomach, Papa," she whispered, looking down. "I must be perfect for my husband." Marcello sneered, but let it go. He drained his glass, and then it began. It started with a cough from the capo on his left, then a gasp. Men who had survived gunfights and ice-pick assassinations suddenly clutched their chests. Their faces, florid and red from wine, turned a ghastly shade of blue. They clawed at their collars. Don Marcello looked at his glass. He smelled it. The faint, unmistakable scent of bitter almonds. He looked at Lucia. Her face was not frightened. It was not tearful. It was perfectly, terrifyingly serene. "You," he gurgled, the word dissolving in his throat as the cyanide constricted his lungs. He fell, his hand outstretched, overturning the table. His capos were convulsing, dying before they even hit the floor. The entire inner circle of the Corelli family, dead in 90 seconds. Enzo Bianco heard the crash. He heard the gurgling. He burst into the room, his gun drawn, expecting to find the Barzinis and a bloodbath. He stopped dead. The scene was apocalyptic. The Don and his four capos were dead or dying, their limbs twitching, their faces locked in masks of horror. There was no blood. There were no assassins. There was only Lucia standing in her white wedding dress, untouched, watching her father's final, agonizing breath. "Lucia," Enzo stammered, his mind unable to process the sight. What have you done?" A whisper came from the shadow of the hallway behind him. "She did nothing, Enzo." He turned, his eyes wide with confusion. Rosa stepped from the darkness. The damaged one. The ghost. Her eyes were not downcast. They were level, and they were as cold as a winter grave. She was holding the garrote wire. "It was a family matter," she said. Enzo didn't even have time to raise his gun. Rosa was on him, a blur of silent, practiced motion. The wire bit deep. He made a sound like a punctured bellows and dropped, his spine severed. The sisters didn't pause to admire their work. They were methodical. They were cleaning house. Lucia, her hands steady, went to her father's desk. She picked up the phone. She called Rocco Barzini's social club. When the capo answered, she screamed. She was hysterical, a perfect performance of terror. "He's dead. Papa's dead. Enzo. God, Enzo betrayed us. He poisoned them. He said he was allied with the gallows. They're coming here. They're coming for everyone." She shrieked and slammed the phone down. Rosa, meanwhile, took Enzo's gun. She fired 3 shots into the ceiling, creating the sound of a gunfight. She fired one into Enzo's own hand. She planted the old, forged note about Bastiano in his pocket. Then she picked up the phone. She used the real ledger. She called the home number of the city's police chief. "Chief Brennan," she said, her voice clear and cold. "This is Rosa Corelli. There's been a terrible accident at my father's home. His consigliere. He went mad." When the police finally cautiously arrived, they found a scene that told a simple story. A bloody, botched coup by a disgruntled subordinate. And in the library, two traumatized orphaned daughters clutching each other, weeping for their lost family. The police chief, his name the first one on page 1 of the ledger Rosa held, declared it a mob-on-mob hit. The Carelli empire was, for all intents and purposes, decapitated. The official story held. The Carelli family was shattered, its leadership wiped out by the treachery of Enzo Bianco and an unknown rival family. The press, fed by the police, called Lucia and Rosa the tragic twins. They were photographed in black veils at the mass funeral, the very picture of orphaned sorrow. The other families, shocked by the sudden vacuum, began to circle, ready to carve up the Carelli territory. And then the strangest thing happened. The Carelli empire didn't crumble. It stabilized. A minor overlooked capo named Arturo the Clerk Rinaldi, a man known for logistics and numbers, not muscle, stepped in as acting boss. And he was brilliant. He didn't start a war, he didn't posture, he simply held. He seemed to know exactly which politicians to call, exactly which judges to bribe, exactly which rival shipments to accidentally tip off to the feds. The other dons were baffled. They couldn't fight an enemy they couldn't see. Arturo the clerk was a puppet, and he knew it. His orders came in the form of typed notes, delivered by a maid from the Carelli mansion, where the two traumatized daughters were living in seclusion. Soon, the notes stopped. The orders came by phone, from a voice he never identified. The Carelli family didn't just survive, it became more efficient, more silent, and more terrifyingly profitable. The violence was replaced by a quiet, bureaucratic terror, all of it controlled by the ledger. As for Lucia and Rosa, the tragic twins were, according to the official family story, sent to a private convent in Sicily to recover from their ordeal. They were never seen in public again. Their names were never mentioned, they were erased just as they had planned. The Carelli mansion sat dark and silent for decades, the headquarters of a ghost empire, ruled by two invisible women who had beaten the Cosa Nostra at its own game, using the one weapon the old men had never thought to guard against, the daughters they had dismissed. We move forward in time, decades pass. The Carelli empire eventually faded, its assets quietly absorbed into legitimate corporations, its power dissolving as the old ways died. The mansion, long abandoned, was finally condemned in 1995. Its contents, rotting and covered in dust, were sold at a city auction. A young historian, a man obsessed with the unsolved mystery of the Carelli massacre, bought a box of tarnished, worthless personal effects for $20. He was hoping to find clues, perhaps a hidden diary, or a letter that would finally explain how Enzo Bianco, a mere consigliere, had managed to poison 5 of the most paranoid men in the country all at once. He didn't find a diary, but deep in the box he found a small silver locket, heavily tarnished, monogrammed with a simple, elegant R. He assumed it was a keepsake, perhaps belonging to the mother. He opened it. Inside there was no picture, just a tiny, tightly rolled slip of paper, brittle as a dead leaf. He carefully unfurled it under a magnifying glass. It was not a note. It was not a confession. It was a list of chemical compounds, all of them readily available in the 1930s. A list of household items and garden plants that, when combined and refined, would create a potent, fast-acting and nearly untraceable neurotoxin, cyanide, extracted from peach pits. And at the bottom of this deadly recipe, written in the precise, elegant script of a Swiss-educated young woman, was a simple 2-word dedication. For Mama. The historian stared at the paper, the cold, clinical truth of it settling on him. The books, the police reports, the mob legends, they were all wrong. It wasn't a coup. It wasn't a rival hit. It was an extermination. It was a matricidal ghost story, an act of methodical revenge, executed by the two people everyone in history had forgotten. The official records of New York's underworld are vast, but the names Lucia and Rosa Corelli are entirely absent, and so the question remains: how many other silent partners, how many invisible daughters, wives, and sisters have been the true architects of the Mafia's darkest secrets, erased from the very history they wrote in blood?